installing and licensing Virtual Center. So up to this point, we have dealt specifically just with the ESX servers in our environment. And in the very beginning, we talked about how there was this sort of management server that allowed you to manage all of the servers in your environment as a single unit. And that server is Virtual Center. And Virtual Center, as we said before, is a separate line item. So if you're making your purchases for ESX, you're going to have to purchase Virtual Center as a separate line item. And it is typically a server that is installed on a separate server outside the environment, though it doesn't necessarily need to be. We're going to talk in this nugget about what Virtual Center's role is inside of the virtual infrastructure, and we're going to talk about the prerequisites associated with Virtual Center. And we're actually going to do an installation of Virtual Center. We'll talk about what you need to have installed and how you want to set it up and how you want to go through the installation process to completely install Virtual Center onto your server. Once we're through with that, then we will go into the process of licensing Virtual Server using Virtual Center's licensing tool, which is a derivative of what's commonly called FlexLM. And we're going to go through this mainly because FlexLM can be a little complicated to understand, a little complicated to get up and running. We'll talk about the license files and what the composition is of the license files and what you need to know about them. So let's start actually and talk about really again what Virtual Center's role is inside of virtual infrastructure. I'm going to go back to this picture that we keep drawing that explains what our environment looks like here. And you've seen this picture before where we've got our ESX infrastructure in here. There's our ESX servers like we've drawn before. And we'll put ESX in here, and ESX here, and ESX here. And then we've got our SAN array that we're connecting into. There's our connections into the SAN array. Now what Virtual Center is whereas before we've been connecting in directly into our ESX servers using the virtual infrastructure client. When we connect in to do the management to this point, we've been connecting into the IP address of the service console of one of our ESX servers. Now that's great because it allows us to monitor and manage that ESX server as a unit, but it's difficult because in order to manage multiple ESX servers all at once, we need to open up multiple virtual infrastructure clients. And also, if we're going directly into the ESX server, we don't have access to some of those higher level enterprise feature sets that come with the Enterprise Edition, like HA and DRS and all of the resource scheduling that allow us to manage all of these servers as a single unit. So what we have down here is we have this Virtual Center server. And this Virtual Center server kind of works with the ESX servers to make sure they're functioning properly, to allow them to integrate with each other. It enables vMotion, it enables the consolidated backup, it enables all of those enterprise functions so that you can manage it as a single unit. Now, in order to be able to use Virtual Center, you have to have some prerequisites, obviously. And I've said before, we've talked about before about how in order to install Virtual Center, you have to have a separate non-virtualized server. And I put a little asterisk next to that. And that asterisk is there because you don't actually have to have a non-virtualized server. It's a best practice to have Virtual Center on its own separate physical box. But you can actually, and it is fully supported by VMware, to put that server in your existing infrastructure as a virtual server inside of your virtual infrastructure. So best practices as opposed to what's supported, for example. Now, Virtual Center installs on top of Windows Server, so you don't have to have a version of Windows Server to install it on. It's not going to install on top of any Linux installation or anything like that, but you do have to have a copy of Windows and Server Edition in order to run it. And in addition to that Server Edition, you're going to have a copy of the .NET Framework. Now, for 3.0.1, which is the version we're using now, the version of .NET Framework we need is version 1.1. And that may change later on, but for now, 1.1 is what's supported in 3.01. You also have to have a database. And Virtual Center does not make heavy use of its database. This is not a really high resource use database that it needs, but it needs some place to store its configuration settings. And that database needs to be one of three types. It's either an Oracle database, a SQL database, or an MSDE database. If you're doing this in a test environment, if you're just setting up this as for demonstration purposes, an MSDE database is going to do just fine for you. However, if you're in a more production environment, you're going to want to go and use a more enterprise class database like Oracle or SQL. And that's just because of all the feature sets that are involved with SQL and Oracle, with backing up and snapshotting the databases and high reliability on the databases. This Virtual Center instance is losing this Virtual Center instance is not going to kill your ESX servers. You're not going to lose all of your ESX servers if you lose your Virtual Center server. But the centralized management of them is going to go away. So you want to make sure that database is is high availability if you've got a lot of high availability needs for your environment. And then lastly, and this sort of goes without saying, you need to have that network connectivity in there to be able to, so that the virtual center server can connect into the individual ESX servers so that it can do the management that it needs to. Now, what sort of connectivity? We'll get to that in a second of what ports you need to have available, but make sure that you have the available network connectivity so that all those servers can connect to each other appropriately if you do firewalling inside of your environment. Since we've been talking about the prerequisites, there's also this concept of licensing. And if you remember back when we did the licensing of the ESX server itself, remember how easy licensing ESX was? We just had our license.lic or our license.txt file, and we took that file and we clicked import file, and poof, it was licensed. And then wow, that was really easy. Well, with Virtual Center, the licensing gets just slightly more complex, because with Virtual Center, you have the option of doing, you're doing what's called license server-based licensing. And if you've never used FlexLM before, FlexLM is a fantastic tool once you get it set up. Setting it up can be a pain in the neck, but once it's set up, it performs so very well. So let's go back to our little picture here and talk about the differences between server-based licensing and this licensed server-based licensing. With server-based licensing, I have my my licenses that I install on each individual host right here. Bam, I got one there, I got one there, bam. It's very easy. So it's very easy to install the licenses, but as I move servers in and out of the environment, I have to have one license for each of the servers in the environment. And so I've got to maintain and manage the individual licenses for each of these servers out here. Now with Virtual Center based licensing, let's say Virtual Center has its own database. Each one of those licenses is now installed in the Virtual Center server, in the Virtual Center license server. And as servers come in and out of my environment, Virtual Center will assign licenses to it that are available. And so if I buy, again, a license for 16 sockets, for example, this is back to the same example we talked about before. If I buy 16 sockets worth of licenses and I'm only using 4, that means that I've got 12 available that I can use. And as soon as I connect those servers in to my Virtual Center environment, it's going to say, oh, look, I have an available license here. So here, go ahead and just use this license. Now, the benefit here, too, is the way that it's done with the licensing is feature sets are also made available, too. So not only do we have the server license, but we also have some feature sets associated with the license as well. This is an example of a sample Virtual Center license file, complements of the VI3 installation guide. I just copied this straight out of the license guide. So you can see an example of what a license file looks like. You'll see at the top we say server, any host, and any. This is one of the ports that's actually used, port 27,000, for managing the system. We also have what's called a vendor daemon here called VMware LM on port 27010. We now have what are called increments or vendor increments, and each increment has to do with an individual feature that you want to enable for the product. You'll see here that this first one has to do with VMware Consolidated Backup. The second one is virtual SMP, the ability to do multiple processors for virtual machines. The next one is for HA, VMware High Availability, and then VMware DRS. So having each one of these increments inside of our license file means that we can enable those sorts of properties and those sorts of features inside of our environment. And so if you're having problems with your environment and you're like, wow, I should have access to this feature and I don't see it in my environment, you'll want to check your license file to make sure that that license file has the proper feature sets installed into it to be able to do essentially what it needs to do. You'll see here the increment here says right here, ESX full backup, ESX full VSMP, VC DAS, VC DRS. Those are the feature set names that help you identify what that license is for. The actual license bits are all these hexadecimal information down here. So this will give you some understanding about what the licenses are as well. The last thing you'll notice about some of these licenses is how they can either be keyed for permanent licenses or they can be keyed for licenses that have an expiry. If you see a date that's in the future in your license file, if that date is somewhere out in the future, you probably have a license that will expire at some point. If instead it says permanent, the word permanent appears in the first line of the file, then likely that license is going to be something that's not going to expire, and you're going to be able to use it ad infinitum. Okay, so enough of the pictures. Let's actually go into our virtual center server and complete the installation. You'll see here we're back on our VMware workstation. Just like everything, we're doing all of this inside of Workstation. And what we've done is we've created a Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition instance inside of our workstation. And this instance is actually going to host Virtual Center. You'll see here the name of this instance is VC Nugget. We also currently have up our iSCSI data store, open filer, and then our first ESX server, ESX Nugget 1. All of these systems are currently being run out of VMware Workstation. So I'm going to go ahead and log into this machine, and we'll see that on the machine we've already downloaded at the time of the recording of this, the most recent version of Virtual Center. You'll see here it's 40644 is the build number. If I double click it, you'll see here that there's a number of items in here that we need to run. If we run the auto run, it's going to begin the process of actually installing Virtual Center. Now, I told you that there were some prerequisites associated with Virtual Center, and if you don't have those prerequisites installed, it's going to install them for you. If you don't have an MSDE database, or if you don't have a SQL or a Oracle database available, it will go ahead and install the MSDE bits onto the machine so that you can begin working right away. You won't have to do it as a separate download. Additionally, you will also be able to install, it will also install for you the .NET framework components. So all of this is going to be in part of the installation of Virtual Center, so you won't have to worry about it. See here that we have the ability to choose Virtual Center Management Server. That's what we're going to do here in a second. We can also install the Virtual Infrastructure Client, and we'll talk about that Virtual Infrastructure Client in a second because we already have that Virtual Infrastructure Client installed. And lastly, we have the license server. We have to have the license server installed for us to be able to use Virtual Center, so we'll be doing that also during this nugget. I'm going to click the link here. We're going to install Virtual Center. You'll see here it pops up. It's a typical installation just like we're used to seeing. And it's going to give us a number of questions that it's going to ask. And the first questions are going to be involved with the prerequisites and all the configuration of Virtual Center and everything we need to do to set it up. So we click Next. And agree to the license agreement, choose next again, and obviously username and organization, all of that stuff in there. And then where do we want to install the Virtual Center information to? I'm going to choose a custom installation so we have all the options available to us. You'll see here that we have the option to choose the management server and web access. And in our case, we want to install both the web access capabilities and the management server capabilities. In a future nugget, we're going to talk all about web access. But web access is essentially a way that if you don't have easy access to the VIC, to the Virtual Infrastructure Client, you can go manage your virtual infrastructure through a web portal. Now it's the same thing like OA is to Outlook, right? You can do a lot of things in OA. It's kind of fuzzy. Sometimes it takes a little while, but you can actually do some things. So if you don't have full access to that Virtual Infrastructure Client, you can use the web access server if you need to. We're going to install both of these so that we have access to both. We're going to, because we don't have an existing database server, we're going to install and use a dedicated MSDE server instance. Now note the MSDE server instance name in here, MSDE _VIC. So it's not the default server instance. If you have an existing database server that's already up and configured, there is some additional configuration that you need to do, and the greatest of which is creating the database and then creating the ODBC connection to the database so that the Virtual Center installation process can populate that database with the correct database tables. In this case, we'll choose install and use the MSDE server instance just because it's easy for our local installation. Lastly, we need to do is install a local VMware license server. If we didn't already have a license server, or if we did already have a license server installed, we can configure and use the existing license server. But we're going to install a local VMware license server and configure our existing instance to use it. At this point, we've been asked to locate the license file that we've downloaded from VMware.com, and I've actually downloaded that file already for us. If we put it in the root of C. So if we go to C:/ and we see this vclicense.lic file, we're going to put that in there. You can really put this license anywhere you want, and in a little bit, we'll show you where the default location where it stores these licenses is once we get to the system up and configured. I'm going to click Next again, and now we get the option to choose what networking ports are available for our virtual infrastructure server, our Virtual Center server, to connect into all of our ESX infrastructure. You'll see here we can change the HTTP and HTTPS ports associated with the web server. We can change the diagnostics port and then the port that is used to remote systems and also for heartbeat and for connections to our ESX servers. If we have an older version of 1.0, the Virtual Center 1.0, we can maintain this backwards compatibility with the web services if we want. And in a lot of cases, most people will only be doing that if they're in the process of migrating from Virtual Center 1.x to Virtual Center 2.x. And Virtual Center 1.x it's been upgraded now for a very long period of time, so likely you will not be needing to check this checkbox. And for the most part, you're going to want to keep these the same unless you want to change the ports in order to obfuscate the ports, especially for web services, to keep prying eyes away from your servers. And click Next again. Virtual Center actually leverages the Apache Tomcat web server to run most of its configurations. It's not an IIS-based service. Now, Apache Tomcat runs on a different port here, 8086, that you can use for Virtual Center. You have the ability to set it for automatic startup and then also to start the Tomcat service. We're going to go ahead and start these so that we can make use of these later on. Once we're finished, we click the Install button, and it begins the installation. It's like I said, it's going to install all the prerequisites and complete the installation of not only the prerequisites, but Virtual Center. So what I'm going to do right now is pause the recording. When we get back, we'll get to the very conclusion of all this installation and begin the configuration of VC once it's installed. Okay, and we're complete. And I just actually clicked the Finish button there, so you didn't get a chance to see the finish screen, but just presume that there's your typical finish screen that we missed here. Once we're done with that, we're back to our VMware Virtual Center installer. And you see here the three items that we talked about before, the management server, the infrastructure client, and the license server. Because we didn't have a license server already installed, we actually installed the license server as part of the Virtual Center management server installation. Now, we already have the virtual infrastructure client installed also because we did that as part of a previous nugget, downloading it from our ESX server. Now, interestingly enough, the same virtual infrastructure client that you use to manage ESX servers is the one that you use to manage your virtual infrastructure. And what's interesting and also somewhat challenging about the virtual infrastructure client is that depending on if you're connecting directly into an ESX box or if you're connecting into a Virtual Center server, the interface will change slightly. The number of selections that you can choose and where those selections are changes very subtly. So you'll find that if you've been working with ESX directly for a while and then you move into VC, all of a sudden things are in different places. So just be aware of that there's going to be a little bit of change to the Virtual Center client even though it's the same one. Let's go ahead and close this down here, and I'm going to go ahead and close this down here as well. And what I want to show you first of all is that if we click Start here and we go to All Programs VMware, we don't actually have the virtual infrastructure client installed locally on this machine, on our server itself. And the intent here is you probably shouldn't need to do any management of your virtual infrastructure environment from your VC server. You should be doing it from your workstation. That's why it's a separate installation. But the one thing I do want to show you is this VMware license server. And if I scroll over just a little bit, you'll see that the license server has two things: the user guide, which is more information about the license server, and then also these license server tools. If I click on license server tools, it's going to bring up an instance of FlexLM, as we were talking about. Now, if you did the installation of the license during the install of LM tools, it does a lot of the initial configuration for you, and that's great because you don't really have to think that hard about LM tools in order to make it function. Now, the thing is that if for some reason something happens and you got to change a feature set or you got to update a license or something like that, using LM tools can be fairly complicated. You'll see here that we have the option of using license file or services. By default, we choose VMware license server service in order to run. We have some utilities here that we can use to check out licenses, to find versions of licenses, to check out vendors and list vendor names if we want to manipulate our licenses. You'll notice here that the default location where those licenses are stored is C program files, VMware, VMware license server, and licenses. And so what it's done is it's copied that .lic file to this location and is running that LIC file from this location. From time to time, you may need to start or stop the service, or what we call reread the license file. If you go in and change entries inside the license file, you may need to go and do a license file reread in order to get it to pick up those changes. And this is one of the processes that people kind of have problems with sometimes because the rereading of the license file can be painful. But this location here is where you can stop the server, where you can start the server. You'll see here I click the stopping server button now. It is actually stopping the server. Once we've completed stopping the server, we can go make changes to our license file and then start the server back up. We can also start the server from this location too. You'll see here it says server start successful. So we have the ability to start and stop the server from this location. One of the most useful tabs in this LM Tools dialog box is the Server Status tab. If I click the Perform Status Inquiry button here, you'll see that I have the option of seeing what LM Tools is actually pulling from our license file. Now, you may think you have a successful license file. You may think your license file is right on the money, but FlexLM may not necessarily think so. And so the only way you can really figure this out is by clicking this Perform Status Inquiry button and determining if your daemon status, your vendor daemon status, is correct. Do you have, for example, 28 licenses? Or how many of those are currently in use? For 34 for vMotion, 28 for DAS, 2 for VC. So the only way for you to really understand if you've got the right licenses and the right feature sets and the right use of those feature sets is to do this Perform Status Inquiry. There's some other stuff here. You can perform some diagnostics based on a feature name if you're having problems with licenses. You can also configure the location for where you want the license file to go. Again, this is our default location, VMware License Server /licenses. The main process that runs FlexLM is this lmgrd.exe process. And you should just remember lmgrd because that's, for all FlexLM installations, lmgrd is the executable that actually runs the license server. So you can change these inside of this config services. Really, the last tab, borrowing, allows you to do some borrowing of licenses and stuff like that. But for the most part, you don't really ever use this feature set. So this is the FlexLM tool, and it's the license tool that is used for Virtual Center to license all the Virtual Center applications. The last thing that we need to do in order to complete the licensing is actually switch our individual ESX servers from their host-based licensing and into their license server-based licensing. And so what we need to do first of all is go to 192.168.0.101 and then we log in as root, just like we've done before with all of our connections into our individual ESX hosts. We move into our ESX hosts and we go to the licensing tab, and from the licensing tab we'll actually migrate the licenses from host-based licensing to FlexLM-based licensing. So here's our ESX server just like we've seen before, and drag this over here. Go to configuration and we're going to go to licensed features. Currently we are licensed, but we're licensed under a host-based model. What we need to change is going from host license file to license server. In this case, our license server is VC Nugget. If I click OK here, it's going to go and look for those licenses. It's going to say, oh, do you have a license? Do you have a host license? Do you have a license server? It looks like, yes, we do successfully have a license server now, VC Nugget. We no longer have a host license file because we can only do one of those things at a time. Once we do that, we click here to edit and make sure we're set at ESX server standard. OK, we're good there. And then we check edit here. We get, OK, we got VMware consolidated backup here. Good. So we are now configured appropriately to connect to VC Nugget to get our license files. I'm going to close this down. And now what we need to do is go on to our Virtual Center server and verify that those licenses indeed did connect from our ESX server into our Virtual Center server. Now, it's the same process as logging onto an ESX box. I go VC Nugget, but instead of logging in as root, I need to log in as a user in my Windows domain now that is administrator on the box that is the VC Nugget box, or it is the Virtual Center box. And so in this case, it's going to be administrator and then the username or the password associated with the administrator. This is the Nugget Lab /administrator for the domain. That's a big change because we're not using the Unix logon authentication just like we did with ESX. We're now using the Windows authentication. So make sure you're an admin on that VC box, or you won't be able to actually do anything with your VC once you get it set up. So once we actually get the virtual server instance created, and you'll see our management interface is popped up here, you'll notice first that we don't actually have any hosts configured in here in our virtual infrastructure client. We have the licensing set up, but we don't actually have it configured to be able to import in those hosts. Now the very first thing we want to do is actually verify that we do indeed have licensing. And if I go ahead and View and Administration, I'll choose the Licenses tab here, and under the Licenses tab, I get an option to take a look at the licenses that are currently consumed. Now you'll see here ESX Server Standard. I see a total of 28 available licenses, and I have 26 that are remaining, which says to me that I have 2 licenses that are currently being consumed at this point. So I know that first server that we connected into the interface actually has been configured appropriately. So let me go back to View again and Inventory and Hosts and Clusters. In order to create and add hosts into my environment, I have to create what's called a data center. And a data center is really the boundary of of our ESX infrastructure. It's kind of the farthest away boundary of the whole ESX infrastructure. And inside of that data center, I can do my DRS and my HA and all that stuff. And all of my feature sets have that boundary at the boundary of the data center. So let's create this data center. You'll see we have a new data center, and we'll call it Nugget Data Center. There's our Nugget Data Center that we've created. Now that we have a data center, we can actually add hosts into that data center by right-clicking and choosing New Host. Now we got to have the host name for that, and in this case we'll just do 192.168.0.101. You may, if you have DNS set up and all these servers inside of DNS, which by the way is a very good idea to do, you may want to put in the DNS fully qualified domain name for those systems. And we also have to have a username and password that will, the VC will proxy through to log on and actually manage that server. And in most cases it's going to be root and then whatever your username and password is for that system. I'm going to click next here, and it's going to go contact that server and find out, okay, are you set up properly? Are you configured okay? And okay, you want to choose to add this host. It doesn't have any virtual machines on it. That's cool. If it had virtual machines, did you want to put it somewhere? Did you want to put those virtual machines inside of this Nugget data center, for example? And then also we'll summarize. When I click finished here, you'll see that it begins the process of attempting to connect into that host. It starts out disconnected because the process to actually implement that connection can take a little bit. And once this is actually configured, once we actually have a solid connection into our host, we'll be able to fully manage that from Virtual Center. Yep, and it looks like it's connected and appropriate. You'll see here we've got our 2 CPU, 2.4 gigahertz. There's our Intel Core 2 Duo. There's 3 NICs on it. Yep, there's our Nugget Data Store, our Nugget Lab NFS, and our local store. So it appears now that we have successfully connected in our first ESX server into our virtual center. And so now we can manage that server. And what I'm going to do between this Nugget and the next is actually bring in that second virtual center server or ESX server into virtual center. So we'll see both of our ESX hosts inside of the virtual center. What we want to do now is we want to do one final configuration as part of this Nugget, and that configuration is really managing the configuration of the virtual center management server itself. A lot of all this stuff that we're going to see, we're going to go over in the next few Nuggets, but what we want to do now is talk about all the things that we can do to manage the virtual center server itself. You'll see here if we click on administration and we look at the management server configuration, we can go back and change how we would have our license server set up. For example, do we want to change it to a different license server? How we want to do our statistics. You'll find when we start talking about performance about how we can monitor statistics for all of our servers and how many samples that we want to provide for those. We can do some runtime settings. What is our unique identifier for the virtual center and also the TCP port for connecting to the virtual center? We have the ability to choose Active Directory. What's our timeout for Active Directory? Do we want to limit how many users and groups we can connect to Active Directory? What's our validation period for synchronizing users against Active Directory? We can set up a mail server if we want to notify ourselves. Let's say you've got a mail server in your environment. You want to get notified whenever actions occur or whenever scheduled tasks complete. You can do that through here. And also if you have SNMP, if you've got HP OpenView or some other SNMP system that you want to be able to manage your virtual center, you can do that here by setting your community strings for it. We can set up for the web service and change those ports for the web service and timeout settings and also options for logging if we want to increase the log size. I would suggest that you do not increase the log size unless you are actually having a problem at this point. And then lastly, we have the database. If we want to change the database password and the number of database connections that need to be created for this connection into Virtual Center. So these are available for us for the actual configuration of the Virtual Center server itself. So what have we talked about today? We've talked about Virtual Center. We talked about the creation of Virtual Center. We talked about where it stands inside of virtual infrastructure. We talked about what it takes to actually get Virtual Center installed. We did the installation and we went into some deep detail on the licensing components of Virtual Center because I think you're going to really need to know those as you manage your Virtual Center infrastructure. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.